say that I need to be saved. Say with me, the devil got his way. I want to know how when you are praying, when you are doomsdaying, how you think you know that someone is listening to what you are saying. So you think that you can tell us how to live our lives, never questioning the source from which our moral code derives. You think that suffering is part of some great plan that's been devised. I wonder when we'll be rid of your life.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Open Air Atheist Podcast. I'm James Theodore Stibble III, and this is episode 20. And this episode's guest is going to be DT Strain of what's your site there, DT?
It's called the humanistcontemplative.org.
Oh, right on. Okay.
I don't think V is in there. I should have just said humanistcontemplative.org.
Right on. And you're a minister, a humanist minister, correct? A reverend or?
Yeah, minister is fine. It's technically it's called a secular celebrant, and a lot of them go by minister. Sometimes it regionally differs. There's a few different terms that are used. But
Would you consider yourself a philosopher?
I try to be,
Okay.
and I guess to whatever degree I am, just depends on how much progress I can make. But I try to be.
So DT here has been on the show before. This past summer, we discussed Buddhism, which I was talking about a naturalistic form of Buddhism, something that could be, or actually that has been incorporated into many atheists out there in their lifestyle, like the secular Buddhists and things like that. And this episode, we're going to be talking about Stoicism and its utility in the skeptical lifestyle. How it could be useful to the atheist in his or her everyday life. And then hopefully I want to kind of move on to talk about this, some things that me and DT are interested in as far as the conscious cosmos, if I could call it that, theories concerning that. So you've been studying Stoicism for quite some time, right?
Yeah, I guess, let's see here. Probably since, probably about 8 years now. 7, 8 years.
Wow, okay. And have you seen benefits in your life from it? I mean...
Yeah, in fact, some of the powerful benefits I saw were very early on, which led me to be very interested in Stoicism from that point on, and it's just been kind of a progression from there. Everything I learn about it, I see benefit from.
Right. I just recently, of course, you'd mentioned it the last time you were on the show, and it kind of piqued my interest, and so I started picking up books. Actually, I have right here, I have a book by Epictetus. I have the handbook, and then I have Seneca. I have a Letters from a Stoic, and I have a book by Keith Seddon. It's called Stoic Serenity, a Practical Course on Finding Inner Peace. And I have a book here, Selected Letters from Cicero, and, of course, Marcus Aurelius's The Emperor's Handbook, and then I have, by The Art of Stoic Joy, I think it's something like that. It's by...
William Irvine, right?
Right, William B. Irvine.
Right.
You have it with you, huh? What's the name of that title, just so people can go get it if they want?
A Guide to the Good Life: The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. It's these books, which ones you read, kind of depend on what kind of reader you are. If you're very technical minded, philosophic type, you'd want to go toward one type of book, and if you're not really interested in highly technical language and things like that, then that book by Irvine that we just said, A Guide to the Good Life, that's an excellent introduction. Another one is the Spiritual Teachings of Marcus Aurelius, which is basically a distillation of his meditations in a very easy reading, friendly, introductory kind of format. And I usually recommend to people some of those easier reads first, and then they can move up from there into more and more technical things. From my understanding, one of the most technical, but also considered some of the most authoritative work on the Stoics is by A.A. Long and D.N. Sedley, and it's called The Hellenistic Philosophers, Volume 1. And they talk about other things too, but that's considered some of the definitive Stoics. But that's very, that's kind of up there. Some people may not want to get that involved with it, because ultimately it's not really about the learning the technical lingo and all of that. It's more, can you apply the ideas in a practical sense in your life and get some results out of it?
Right. It's not so scholastic. It's more pragmatic and practical.
Yeah. So if the technicalities start to get in the way of understanding or application, then that's a problem.
Well, maybe you could just go over a few things that you found helpful about the Stoic philosophy.
Sure. Well, the first really powerful thing that's probably the easiest to talk about right off the bat is what I call the control doctrine, but I give concepts, names so that I can refer back to them easily. But basically, it's the Stoic concept on control, and by that I mean those things that we control and what we don't control. And quite a lot of distress and suffering comes about because we forget what we have control over and what we don't have control over, and we muddy those things together, and we become attached to things that we don't really control. And so, one of the first things that people tend to do when they approach this issue of control is they tend to think, well, I've got some control over this, and I've got a lot of control over that, and I've got a little bit of control over that. They imagine the spectrum of control. And I would call that influence. But the Stoic notion of control is a lot more absolutist, and there are reasons for that. But basically, the Stoics will say, you do not control your health, your wealth, your relationships, your reputation, your material gain, your political power. None of those things are things that you control. Because ultimately, you can be overridden. No matter what you try to do, there's always a vast number of other variables that go into the mix. And so none of that is a certainty. Of course, you can do things to try to be healthy and to try to build healthy relationships and try to have a nice family or what have you, or a good career. But ultimately, it's not 100% within your control. And so things will happen that are beyond your control, no matter how good you are and no matter how much you try. And, a lot of people, when things go wrong, they go over this grueling thing in their head, and they think, I tried so hard, I did everything right, why did this happen? Why did this have to happen to me? Because, I don't deserve this. Well, the Stoics say that none of these things are in your control, and it was a mistaken judgment for you to have bought into that notion and acted and lived in such a way that you believed it. And so what they will say is that there's really only one thing that is within your control, and that is your will, your choice, your perspectives, your values. Those things that you choose internally, those are within your control. And just to give you an illustration of how far they take that idea, if I were to decide to pick up a glass off the table, cup, the part that was in my control was my choice to do that. But the moment it left my mind, it started traveling down my arm. The whole rest of that action, my movement of my arm to go and pick up the cup, was not in my control. After that point, it's a matter of physics. It's just atoms bumping into atoms, carrying on down the line. And so that's how strict they are with this notion of control. And what that whole perspective is designed to do is to get you into an adjusted mindset where you realize that, yes, I can try to do this and I can try to do that, and I should try to do these things, but I'm not going to be attached to the outcome of my efforts. And just to put this in terms of, because usually what happens at this point is someone will say, well, that sounds like you'd have no reason to ever do anything, that you would be nihilistic or defeatist, or you wouldn't care.
Right.
But there's a whole other, this is one tiny little piece of the Stoic puzzle that I'm talking about here. There's a whole other system around this, and some of the other big important parts of Stoicism focus on living in accordance with nature, in accordance with our nature as human beings, as rational moral animals. And then from that comes in play concepts of virtue and making choices that are virtuous choices. So the one thing you can control is your will. And when you live in accordance with your nature as a social, moral, rational being, then you will behave virtuously. And if you do so, then you can be content in the fact that you chose to live as virtuously as you could, motivation-wise. And then whatever happens after that, whether things go according to plan or they don't, if you've been responsible and you've made the right decisions, you can rest assured that you have no regrets. The rest of those things are outside your control. So let me put it in terms of something that a lot of atheists might understand and a lot of humanists might understand, which is in terms of social activism. A lot of social activists get burnt out. They get upset. They see things that don't go their way. They're out there. They're doing their best to change society, to fight the good fight and everything. And after a while, it wears on you, and you get all these negative feelings building up, and these disappointments happen, and frustrations. And after a while, a lot of activists get burnt out. Well, what Stoicism does is it allows you to redirect your focus from being a person who says, I must change this, I must change the world, to being where your focus shifts. And now your focus is, I must be the kind of person that tries to make change in the world. And so it's a very subtle difference, but it's a very important difference.
Right.
Because in the second case, that is detaching your sense of contentment and happiness from those things outside your control, because you can't control what the world does or what other people choose to do. You can only control what you do. So if you attach your sense of well-being to the goal of I'm going to be the kind of person that does good things, then it doesn't matter whether or not those things come to fruition or not, because that isn't what you've attached to. You haven't attached yourself to outcomes.
Right, and you can't control what other people do. I mean, I see the dangers and harm of, religious fundamentalism, and so I've had this attachment towards trying to change that. But in reality, I can't. It's not ultimately up to me. I mean, I can make videos, I can do podcasts, I can do rap songs, whatever, and try to influence the world. But ultimately, what the world does or what my community does around me is not up to me. And, coming to realize that recently, because, I when you start talking about how activists, kind of become, have negative feelings, they get burned out. I've been like that recently because I've been getting a lot of flack from both sides of the fence, and I have invested a lot into my activism, and that's one thing that I've been realizing internally in myself, thinking about, mulling over in my mind is, hey, buddy, this isn't helping anybody. This is hurting you. And so it's not about not doing anything and being fatalistic or being, like you said, feudalistic, but it's about being realistic and realizing that you can't change the world. However, you might be somebody who inspires somebody who will start a movement that will. But you ultimately,
but these notions of control, they're very tricky and they're very subtle, and they get into our minds in a lot of ways. So
yeah.
Here's the trick behind this whole thing is that if you want to do something like you say, well, I'm going to be a compassionate person. I'm going to go out. I'm going to do compassionate things. I'm going to save all these people. I'm going to end starvation or whatever it is you're going to do. If you go out there and your condition for happiness is that fewer people starve, you're going to run into some problems. But what Stoicism does is it recognizes that the source of happiness, the wellspring of true happiness, which is a deep, contented happiness independent of circumstance, is attached to our character. In other words, I'm going to do compassionate things not because I need to have result X, Y, Z, but because being a compassionate person will allow me to have a happy life. And that's where we get into this Stoic idea of the Stoics believe that we ought to live in accordance with nature. And I like to write that with a capital N because that's a very all-encompassing thing when they talk about nature. And it includes our nature as human beings. And when we live in accordance with our higher nature as human beings, that part of our nature that is the intellectual, social, reasoning, rational being, when we live in accordance with that, then the fruit of that is happiness and contentment. And so the source of our happiness is being compassionate, being virtuous, being, whatever collection of, wise character traits we can be. That's the source of the good life. It's not that I accomplished 1, 2, and 3 or, various things. What we accomplish is ultimately not only not within our control, but almost definitely meaningless in itself. Marcus Aurelius said in his Meditations, and of course that was a book written to himself. This was his journal. He would write to himself to remind himself of things. And he would write to himself, if you're feeling upset, remember that one day you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you. And, the universe is a big place. It's going to go on a long, long time. And even if we think that we might make a difference, it's very likely that one day everything we do, everything we know will be gone and forgotten, and no one will ever know that it ever took place. a billion years from now. I mean, those things are going to get washed away like sand on the beach. And so there is no thing that stands the test of time. Everything is changing all the time. So with that being the case, our goal has to be to live in accordance with our nature and to do the right thing because it is within our nature to do the right thing. And when we live in the way that we evolve to live, the way that we are best able to live for our mutual well-being, then we have a happy life. It's a matter of engineering from my perspective. Personal engineering. What is the best way to live? How do we live in a way that is suitable to our nature as human beings, such that we prosper and thrive together? And that's what it's about.
Is it possible to be a Stoic somewhat without even knowing it?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a natural disposition which kind of leaned them in those directions. I think I did in some ways, but it's kind of like, it's kind of like artistic ability. Everybody can learn some degree of artistic methods and become better at drawing. And some people have more of a talent for it than others, just by their natural disposition. But even if they do have such a disposition, they're going to be that much better off by studying the distilled, the powerful stuff, and then applying it in their life.
Right. Well, the reason why I asked you is
that disposition can often gain the most just from a tiny drop of Stoicism. It's amazingly powerful.
Right. The reason why I asked you is I spent quite a few years on the streets, being homeless, and I didn't have a family support network. So if I got laid off or something, well, hey, there was no place for me to go other than the mission, or and then the mission maybe was worse than the streets, so I'd end up on the streets. And so life was hard and full of all kinds of things that are out of your control, anxieties, and you lay there in this bush, wrapped up in a tarp, thinking about, what could happen to you, and how am I going to do this, and how am I going to do that now? And I think life kind of made me a Stoic in some ways, because I found myself saying to myself, okay, let's prioritize here. What is it that is in my control? Because I'm going crazy here. I'm driving myself nuts with all these anxieties. So I can't control a lot of things, but here's what I can do, and I am doing it. So then since I started doing that, I didn't have any more panic attacks. I learned eventually how to actually go to sleep without sitting there and mulling over things that I can't control in my mind, which is where a lot of this anxiety came from. And so that's like I had my own sphere of choice without even knowing it. Maybe not to the degree that the Stoics did, but I definitely grasped a part of that without even knowing that this was a Stoical thing. And then also not worrying so much about what people said to me or how they acted, but saying, you know what, I'm just going to act the way I feel I should act, because that's really the only thing I have control over are my actions. And if someone insults me or if somebody looks down at me, well, that's on them. I can choose not to put a negative spin on that and choose to say, well, who cares? Or, well, I know that I'm doing right. So, that's really what matters. Am I out to, is life all about getting people's attention and approval? Well, if that's what it is, I'm in, deep shit here, So I think, so when I started reading these books, I was like, wow, I was actually doing that for quite a while. So at least some of that I have learned.
That makes a lot of sense, because Stoicism developed, a lot of the people, despite the fact that Marcus Aurelius was an emperor.
Epictetus
was a slave. Right. And so not only the individual thinkers, but the times that they lived in were very harsh times. with a lot of death and a lot of loss going on. And so it makes a lot of sense that people in hard times would come to similar solutions. That's the thing about truth, which makes it different from dogma, is that people will stumble upon it independently. It doesn't just spread like a virus from one source.
Right.
People find it all over the place because they come to the truth, because it's an objective thing. It's something that, if these things are helpful, they're helpful, and if they're not, they're not. So that makes a lot of sense, and it also touches on another aspect. I mean, we're just barely scratching the surface here of all this, but there's so much more to it. Like, for example, there's another thing I call the judgment doctrine, and that is the way the Stoics approach this notion of judgment. And so, a lot of people, they've heard the word Stoic, but they have kind of a distorted idea of Stoicism because of that. Right. Stoicism, like Mr. Spot, where you don't have any emotions. What it's about is that the Stoics believe that all of the harmful, distressing emotions, the obsessive or enrapturing kind of passions where you lose control, or you lose perspective and you lose your equanimity in life, those truly harmful kinds of passions, that those things arise because of misjudgments. And it doesn't seem like it. Like, for example, you mentioned, I'm not going to worry about what this other person says or whatever. I'm going to be how I am. I'm not going to let them control me that way. And, a lot of people say, well, that person makes me so mad. But Stoicism calls to our attention that no one can make you mad. Right. What happens is there's an external stimulus, and then there's our emotional reaction to it. But in between those two things is this moment of judgment. Nothing can trigger an emotion unless it has been judged as being a bad thing. And that, somewhere in there, our mind has made a judgment that a response of uncontrolled rage is somehow productive. And
right.
Of course, that's And so what Stoicism does is says sometimes that little moment of judgment is so quick and so deeply ingrained that it goes by us without notice. It just seems like an automatic thing. Some people are just totally wrapped up and consumed by their emotions when these things happen. And
right. Well, that's exactly what it is. It's an impulse. They're just going off impulse. They're not thinking about it. They're not.
Right.
They're
so Stoicism starts by first calling it out to us intellectually, saying, look, there's this moment of judgment. You're deciding that you're going to get mad from this. And then the most important part, though, as Epictetus would say especially, is that we can read all day about Stoicism, but until we start putting it into practice and it starts to actually shape our habits and mold the way we live our life and the way we think and act, that we can eventually get to a point where we slow down that process and we're more conscious and aware of it. And when the impulse comes, we are aware of our judgment, and we make a judgment in alignment with our higher knowledge instead of, what it was before. And we can start to mold those habits and our character changes.
Wow. Yeah. I think it's a little easier said than done. I've been trying to incorporate that recently, and people will. I'm naturally one of those kind of people. I've got to always have the last word. Two, I'm extremely stubborn. I mean, I've got to refute you. So I get a lot of, obviously, I interact a lot of people with comments in my videos and podcast episodes, and they'll say things that are just utterly wrong or just ridiculous. And I feel like I have to correct every single person. And, it's like that SKCD comic, someone is wrong on the internet. It's kind of like, when you're a little kid and you're in this big room and someone says, don't touch the red button. Well, now you really want to touch the red button. And that's the thing is that I'm a fixer. I have to fix people, and I have to I have to refute people, and it's this whole testosterone thing, which I've been trying to kind of get over that, because ultimately that's meaningless. I'm not really solving anything. They've already made up their mind that they're right, and I'm wasting my time with a lot of them. So I've been trying to kind of apply that, and when I get insulted, not get. It has been working some, but I still have a long way to go, and I probably will for the rest of my life. I think that the Stoic sage is really some sort of thing that you're stretching and reaching for, but probably will never 100% grasp.
Yeah, I doubt that there's a perfect. Just for the listeners, the sage is the perfect practitioner of Stoicism, and the sage is referred to a lot as a means of example or what have you. And so I think quite a lot of people agree that the sage, which is the perfect practitioner, is more of a thing to strive for, and it's an important model to talk about for the purpose of illustrating what the ideal is of the practice. But everyone reaches that in degrees, kind of like we were talking about enlightenment when we talked about Buddhism.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that that same thing. It's another one of those things that you probably will never achieve, but you. I think of Stoicism as a type of enlightenment. The more I read it, it's kind of like the same. I mean, there's so many similarities between Buddhism and Stoicism. It's ridiculous. It's almost like they were like in cahoots with each other sometimes.
Yeah, it's downright bizarre. In fact, I say I've been studying Stoicism for 7 or 8 years, but in actuality, I've been studying what might be called Greco-Buddhism, which is Stoicism and Buddhism, and then a few other isms thrown in there around the edges. Got some Taoism and things like that.
Gotta love those isms.
What's really interesting is that I view Stoicism as the nexus between the East and the West, because like you said, the amount of overlap is astonishing. And what I've been doing over these past years, probably maybe past 4 or 5 years, is carefully going through the different teachings and philosophies within Stoicism and Buddhism most centrally, and parsing out what are the things that are the same, but they're using different words to describe it. What are the concepts that are opposed, and what are the concepts that are addressed in one but not in the other? And it's kind of like a big puzzle piece. And what I've found is that really there's this one view, this one way of approaching life and approaching the universe and approaching how we think, act, behave, live, and practice. And it goes all the way from a certain perspective on the way the world is up to that eventually leads to principles that lead to prescriptions or behavioral sorts of endeavors, and that those lead to practices. And this whole stream that goes from is to ought, it's this one particular philosophy, really. And Stoicism hits on different points along the road, and it emphasizes different ones than Buddhism does, but they fit together like a very good puzzle. And so what I've been doing is coming up with common terms for each of the ideas that match up, and then figuring out some very interesting things as to what one has that the other doesn't, and or that one focuses on more greatly while the other one focuses on other areas. And what I've found is that you can come up with a pretty powerful cocktail of practices whereby certain things that aren't addressed as much in one philosophy are reinforced by things that are addressed in the other philosophy. And just to give an example of that, you remember we were just talking about that moment of judgment, and you said easier said than done. Well, Buddhist mindfulness, which is something that you get from practicing meditation, is specifically aimed at being more and more aware of your inner disposition, your inner thoughts. So you can actually apply Buddhist mindfulness that you get from meditation to the Stoic endeavor of paying more attention to your judgment. And so that is a methodology you can use to apply Stoic teachings in a deeper, more intuitive, habitual sort of way. And that's just one example, but there's all kinds of fascinating things along those lines that I've been working through.
Now, I've also noticed, as somebody who reads and translates the New Testament Greek text, I've noticed some similarities between Stoicism and Reformed theology, the Calvinistic providential election type thing. And there's so many similarities in there. You got the Logos, you got the providential determinism. It's very similar. It's almost like, I would say, even more similar to Christian Calvinism than it is to Buddhism. It's almost like they took from both of those things, but yet Stoicism predates Christianity. So I would think it would be more on that Christianity took from Stoicism, particularly the writings of Paul and John.
Stoicism was such a big influence on the thinking of the times leading up to that. It basically played into a lot of early Christianity, and then that carried itself into the later Christianity. But it was definitely a big influence. Now, what the Christians did was, and this will be of particular interest to your audience, I would think, what happened was when a lot of these terms and ways of thinking got into Christian hands, they became more personified and more supernaturalized.
Anthropomorphic.
Stoics looked at it. Like, for example, like you mentioned, the Logos.
Right.
The Logos, Logos, is, the Stoics would say, the underlying rational order upon which the universe operates.
Right. It can be translated logic.
Yeah. And so we might call it the laws of physics today. And now, whether or not that's a personified being or whether it's a rationality in a more abstract sense, kind of a Spinozan God or a God in the Einsteinian sense, those are matters of interpretation, and actually Stoics differed on that, different Stoic figures. But early on, the concept of the Logos, even before Stoicism was founded, came from Heraclitus. And Heraclitus, if you read his text, he was called the obscure philosopher because he said a lot of stuff people couldn't figure out what the hell he was talking about. But not only in the content, but even in that sort of koan form of speaking, Heraclitus very much resembles Taoist philosophers, in that he talks about nature and he talks about the way nature operates and how different forms of materials transmute into others and complexity, and he talks about all these different things. And he came up with the concept of the Logos. Well, what happened is that by the time the Christians pick it up, it becomes turned into the Word of God, and in the more sense that we think of it today, where almost it's just like, oh, Logos just means what the guy with the big beard in heaven is talking about. So there are all kinds of different levels and ways to interpret this stuff, but for a modern naturalist who wants to use Stoicism, they can use Logos to mean the laws of physics and the underlying sort of order and complexity on which the nature of the world operates, natural law, so to speak. And when they do that, they find that the later philosophy on which that worldview is built, that leads to Stoic ideas, is very sound, and it still works.
Right. Sorry, I was just looking up something here on that Keith Seddon had wrote a little paper on this, and I was trying to find it. Let's see here.
Now, if I remember right, I don't think. Well, I don't want to speak for Keith Seddon, but I'm pretty sure he's not a naturalist.
Yeah, I didn't kind of get that impression from reading his stuff there. Although,
but he is a very knowledgeable person on Stoicism.
See, that's kind of the tricky part there, because they were materialists, and some people would argue they were vitalists. But I would say, from what I've gleaned from them thus far, they were materialists. They didn't seem to be non-naturalistic. They don't believe in disembodied souls and spirits. At least I haven't gotten. I mean, some of them seem to be agnostic about the issue, but there's no doctrine. I'm sorry.
Take for example the concept of the soul. When you read, even go back before the Stoics, when you read the dialogues of Plato, and you read of at least Plato's report of Socrates talking about the nature of the soul, that description sounds very much like people who are looking at the natural world around them and trying to figure out why is it that life forms move around, do things. And the things that they talk about as they try to reason through it with one another, it's clear that when they're using the word soul, they mean something a lot closer to what we say when we say mind today. They're talking about something that they figured in their time was a hypothesis, and it was natural in its approach. It was, there's this stuff, and it does these things, and this is how people. So it's a very natural, rational approach to the concept of the soul. But then what happens is that later, and
people build on that.
Late is the 2nd century A.D. or C.E. That when Jesus didn't return when they all thought he should, different ideas started to creep into theology, and you started to get this split between the natural world and this unseen, unseeable, unknowable, unapproachable supernatural world, and everything that they couldn't explain or that was of ultimate meaning got tossed into that dark bin. And so before that point, you had a lot more of a naturalistic sort of understanding of these words and concepts. So you really have to reinterpret what they're talking about when you read ancient philosophers, because if you use Christianized understandings of these words, when you read Greek philosophers, you're going to completely miss the point. You're going to get a completely different idea about what they're talking about and what they intended.
Right. Well, from reading Seneca and these other guys, I really don't get the impression at all that they were dualists. They were absolutely monists, and so I think they were naturalists, or at least a type of, I would say, a primitive naturalism. They didn't really have the information that we have now, but they definitely did not. I at least have not gotten that impression that they believe that there's some sort of soul that continues on after death, or that God is this immaterial being. To them, God, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to them, God is nature. It is the universe, but it's conscious. Am I right so far?
Whether or not it's conscious is arguable, and whether or not they thought of it as conscious depends on the exact Stoic figure.
Now that's
Epictetus had was very much on the kind of personified conscious end of the spectrum, but Zeno, Heraclitus, and some of those earlier ones. Heraclitus wasn't technically a Stoic; he was a precursor to the logos concept, like we mentioned. But there are the others that are much more on the impersonal sort of interpretation. But I think most people that are knowledgeable about Stoicism will debate that and say that there was a notion of providence, which was that this is the way things are supposed to happen. But again, there's an impersonal and a personal way of interpreting providence. So it's kind of complex stuff. But
yeah. Yeah.
The ultimate thing is that there is a naturalistic modern interpretation of these things, which do lead logically to a lot of the Stoic practices, and they do help. I mean, I've used them, and they seem consistent. They seem rationally consistent with my understanding of the world. I haven't had to start worshiping Zeus or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess some atheists could, be flipping through some pages here and going, seeing Zeus or the word God and going, ooh, let's close the book. But I think when you take into consideration that these people lived, over 2,000 years ago, and take into consideration the cultural factors, they are a product of their environment to some extent. When you take those into consideration, it's so easy to, at least for me, to reinterpret that as I'm reading. It's really not such a big deal or a turnoff to me. Now, one thing, because I was reading this paper and you said Keith Seddon is not a naturalist, and I was wondering what you meant by that.
Well, I don't want to get too much into, speaking for him or anything like that, but I seem to recall some conversations that I've seen him have on forums and things like that, which led me to believe that maybe he did have some, if they weren't supernatural, technically speaking, that maybe he had some beliefs about more of a personified personal deities and things like that.
Right.
But
I was just curious
about that. This is very vague stuff, so
right.
Really better to ask him about that.
Right.
But in any case, there is a spectrum of people that follow Stoicism and that get a lot of usefulness out of Stoicism that range from pure naturalists like myself all the way to Christian Stoics. So,
yeah, because it's compatible with a lot of different religions.
Yeah, and that'll happen whenever you're talking about philosophies that have very practical applications to them. Just like many Christians have now started meditating and doing yoga and things like that.
Right. Okay, so I wanted to. I was reading his paper, and he was saying that he was trying. I guess he was trying to argue for consciousness, but it wasn't like consciousness in the sense that you and I are conscious. Because right now, I think the universe is conscious. You and I are the universe, and we're conscious. I kind of have a Carl Sagan outlook on that right now.
Yeah. Well, if you say, it's actually quite true. I mean, if you say that, for example, my brain, and you ask, is my brain conscious or not? Well, most people say, yeah, it is. But not every part of my brain is conscious. It's mostly up here in the frontal lobes, and you've got in the cortex. You've got the cerebellum, you've got other areas of the brain which are not conscious, but nevertheless, the whole thing is one system, and as a whole, you can say because it has parts that are conscious, that it's conscious. You can similarly do something like that with the universe if you chose to, and you say, well, we are that part of the universe that knows itself, like Carl Sagan said, as you mentioned. And so the universe has a subcomponent to it that is conscious, and that's us. But I would suspect that Keith Seddon is arguing for something beyond that as well. Is that correct?
Right, where he didn't really specify, I think, too much on what he meant by consciousness. Either that or I just didn't read the whole paper, but it was kind of long.
Yeah.
But it kind of was like, well, it seemed to me, and Keith, if you're listening to this, I don't think you even listen to this show, but if somehow this gets
I hope he does chime in if he does happen to hear it, because, like I said, I don't feel comfortable speaking for other people and their personal beliefs.
Well, I sent him
if he said anything wrong.
I sent him an email not too long ago asking him to come on the show. But I think maybe the title "Open Air Atheist" might be a throw off. But he'd said something about in his paper how it could be a type of consciousness, but it would be absolutely different because the universe is the totality of existence. So therefore, it's not like it could be conscious of anything outside of itself because it isn't. There's nothing outside of itself to be conscious of. So, so it could be like a type of consciousness. And then I heard, you see those pictures of people comparing inside of the human brain to, the cosmos, and look how it looks similar. You've got all those web connections.
Well, we have to be careful about science and all this, of course. But, I have some really specific things to say about that. Before I get into that territory, I just want to note, we're moving kind of out of the practical application stuff into the more esoteric
now I'm just kind of toying around,
but which is fine, because that's very fascinating stuff to talk about. I just want to note to the listeners that we're doing that, and that before I leave that little practical section, that there's a whole lot more to explore about Stoicism that have to do with those practical living a happy life stuff. So, having said that, let me get to some of this other stuff which I love, is the stuff about consciousness. I'm reading a paper right now before I get to that, let me talk about David Chalmers. David Chalmers is a philosopher who a lot of his work deals with consciousness. And if I understand correctly, he is the one that first came up with the distinction between the easy problem of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. And to do it, he used zombies, but not in the normal sense of the word zombie. There's this concept called a philosophical zombie. And what that is if you imagine this third-person description of atoms and how they interact leading up to cells and tissues and organisms. And you imagine you could have all of this stuff completely understood. You have mathematical models of it. You have a computer simulation of it, all the way up the scale, and it's all operating smoothly. You know everything there is to know about why neurons fire and how they work and how they process information and all of that. You can imagine this mathematically sound model if we had all of this information. And if there's a person sitting in a chair and you poke the person with a needle, you could chart out and explain how the needle affects the nerves, how that nerve sends a signal up to the brain. Once the signal gets into the brain, what things it affects inside the brain, which eventually lead to the motor cortex making the mouth open, and then the lungs contract, and then vibrations of air go through the vocal cords. And you can explain the scream that the person will have when you poke them. You can explain all of that. You can explain everything a human being does, from the atomic all the way up to everything. And yet, all of that would be possible without the first-person conscious awareness that we have. And I want to point out that consciousness is not just possession of data. It's not just, if I record information onto a floppy drive, the floppy drive isn't conscious of that information. That's not what we're talking about. When we talk about consciousness, we're talking about a first-person feeling of what it is like to be that being. So if I see the color red, there's something it feels like to see the color red. There's something it is like to be a biochemical information processing brain.
Qualia.
This kind of isness to what it is like to be that. And philosophers call that qualia, Qualia. Qualia is that thing it is like to have that first-person experience. Now, if that didn't exist, a philosophical zombie would be something that mechanically it does everything a person does. It takes in information, and if you ask it, how do you feel? It'll tell you how it feels. It'll mimic emotions. It'll do all of that stuff, but all without that first-person sense of consciousness. And technically speaking, all I know is that I have it. I don't really know that you have it. But it's a pretty safe bet that, all human beings have it.
Right.
But, that's the concept, is that that's the difference between the easy question and the hard question of consciousness. The easy question is, can you explain how it all functions? The hard question is, why should any group of atoms or material or matter or energy ever create a first-person perspective, a first-person feeling what it is like to be that thing? Why should, no matter how complex it is, Why should any complex collection of interacting atoms ever generate that feeling? And that's a real mystery of the universe. It's a hard mystery. It's something that, if you really think about it, it means that it's really not that outrageous to presume some pretty incredible stuff there. But the way Chalmers handles it is he says that if we have certain level of complexity, a certain level of complex interactions of a certain nature, that he believes that that would generate a conscious experience, and that it would generate qualia, regardless of whether it's a biological brain or some other kind of complex system. And when we ask why, his answer to that, or his proposed answer at least, has been that maybe it's because that is a basic fundamental property of the universe. In other words, nobody asks why mass does the things it does. At some point in the explanations, you get down to fundamental properties of the universe. And those are just the way things are. And so it could be that just the way the universe is, when different little causal interconnections of highly complex systems get going, that a conscious experience is generated.
Right. I mean, well, just real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of where I'm at with the whole logos thing is, I think it's kind of interesting that, here we are in this universe, and conscious observers exist. And some people might think that's an accident. I don't think it's an accident, depending on what you mean by accident. I think that it couldn't have been any other way. I think that the universe is logical, maybe not intentionally. And so it is unavoidable for it eventually to create logical beings. So I think that we're a product of a logical cosmos. But what I would be wondering about is it conscious? And I don't see any reason at this point to believe that it's conscious, at least in the sense that we're conscious. And I or any kind of conscious. But yeah, I mean, I think obviously I'm talking about necessity. We live in a universe that is logical. It exists, and in order for something to exist, it must be logical. You can't break the law of identity and all that stuff. So I think it's unavoidable that we would become that we would come into being. I'm having a little trouble trying to articulate this because I haven't really thought about this enough to sit down and write a paper on it or anything. But I think you kind of understand what I'm saying, hopefully.
I think I do. One thing I would ask about, though, is, the universe operates on logical principles, and so we as these structures that operate on logical principles and proceed from them functionally makes a lot of sense. And so, but I still wonder if you're talking about in terms of, like, if you imagine us like robots, we're taking in data from our environment, processing that data, and then applying it to our goals to achieve X, Y, and Z. And so there's this continuous sort of operational, functional thing that our brain is doing. And if that's the case, then that's really that first problem of consciousness, where we're modeling, what information we have and how we're handling the information.
Right, the zombie thing.
Yeah, so it's not necessary for us to have that first-person experience in order for an organism to do everything we do. The organism could have the data of its surrounding map, could have the data of who it is.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm
all of that stuff.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that somehow this consciousness that we have, this awareness, is a product of these physical processes. To what extent, how that works exactly, we don't know yet. And maybe we'll never know, or maybe it isn't entirely that. But it would make sense to me that if that is the case, if consciousness can come from non-consciousness, then it would make sense that if this universe is logical in its nature, not in intentional, but just in its nature, then it would make sense that it would only make sense that eventually we would exist. But I don't know about. See, this is hard because we don't even know what consciousness is. We talk about it.
Good ideas of it when we look at people who have had different sorts of brain states and brain injuries. There are examples of people that have had different regions of brain damaged, and so they become less conscious of certain types of things, and they're fully conscious of other kinds of things. And when we look at those types of things, we can get some insight on, exactly when do we get that consciousness and when do we not. The paper I'm reading right now is a paper on called Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness, IIT. And what that author points out is, and I should look it up here to tell you, but what he points out is that, we all know what consciousness is because we lose it every night and we regain it in the morning.
Right.
So we still have brain activity going on while we're asleep. And I'm talking about the periods of sleep without the REM, deep sleep. And then we regain it again, even though we had brain activity throughout. So at some point, there's some quality to the activity. It's not just brain activity. It's a certain kind of activity of a certain level of complexity, and even within a certain level of complexity, a certain type of complexity. And so what he does is the Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness. I'm looking him up because I should say his name. Yes, his name is Tononi, T-O-N-O-N-I. And what he proposes is he's got a mathematical model that measures integrated information. And by that, he means a system that has complex information which is integrated across its entire system. In other words, it's not contained with any one little subset. And I can't probably do it justice, but when you measure these things mathematically, there's a lot of formulas involved and all this, but when you measure it, you come out with this factor called phi, and it measures the level of this integrated information. And he provides some examples from computer simulations and some conceptual examples, because it's too hard to do the calculation in the brain, and so there's just too many variables. But some examples and some thought experiments that kind of show that these are the nature of the kinds of interactions that lead to consciousness. And he even shows the difference between the kind of brain activity when you're asleep versus the kind of brain activity when you're awake, and the differences in the kind of structures and activity in the conscious regions of the brain versus the unconscious regions of the brain. And so it's the beginnings of this mathematical model of just what kind of structures generate a conscious experience. And the interesting thing about it is that it's not a yes or no thing. It's a level thing. There's levels of gradations. And so another thing that he says about it is that you can measure this in a system, and it's not important that data be coming into the system or that data be going out of the system, input-output. You can have a conscious entity without that input-output. And so it's not a question of being conscious of some external facts. It's a question of having that experience without, take the example of somebody who's had a brain injury where they have no memory. Well, they can still have a conscious experience even without memory. So this is possible even in a closed-off system, and that gets back to the thing you said about the universe. Now, that doesn't mean that the universe has a high phi factor, but even if you looked at subsets of this mathematically, according to his theory, the subsets like say human brains, for example, could have a high phi factor, but the factor over the whole system of the universe as a whole would have a very low phi factor. But nevertheless, what this points out is that if this is true, that we as naturalists have a very profound thing to face up to, and that is that if it's true that there's no such thing as souls, and that everything is just atoms in the void and physics and what have you, then that means something extremely amazing, which is that atoms can create first-person experience. And if that's true, then there should be no reason why it couldn't be true for other systems, like, say, artificially intelligent systems of a sufficient complexity. But it also means that it could be true in other types of systems that we don't necessarily think of it as true. There could be certain complex structures in nature that maybe aren't even counted as biological life that generate some sort of level of consciousness. And we'd have no way to interact with it or really communicate with it to ever know that for certain. But it obviously would be a very low level of consciousness. But I wrote to Chalmers one time asking some questions, and he said, if you're suggesting that a thermostat could have some incredibly low level of consciousness of some sort, I couldn't rule it out, And so that's some pretty amazing ideas. But, of course, none of this leads to a guy in the sky who tells us not to cheat on our wife.
Right.
But, but it's still some fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wish we had more time. It's going on over an hour now, maybe?
Yeah, I guess these topics by their nature just go on and on. But,
yeah.
I love talking about this stuff. I hope your listeners have enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, it's great. This is stuff that I read about all the time and find very interesting. The whole, I don't know, the whole cosmos conscious thing just really has been getting me lately, because the universe does have a certain type of order to it. And I'm not arguing for creationism or anything like that, so don't get me wrong. But by nature, the universe
makes science possible. Science wouldn't be possible unless there were some kind of predictable order to the way the universe acted.
Right. And there are distinct designs and patterns that you see throughout nature. And I don't know what the dots are here and what I'm trying to connect them to, but I don't know. I'm kind of, lately I've been thinking a lot about just reality and how things are in the universe. And, could there be other consciousness out there? And what is consciousness? And just these basic questions. But I mean, at the same token, though, if the universe had been in another order, we'd probably be sitting here going, wow, look at this orderly universe. Anyways, so, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it just couldn't be any other way. So I'm kind of...
We're going to have to talk about complex systems theory. That's some fascinating stuff there. That really leads to a lot of that stuff. I wanted
to get into that. That's really interesting. Could you come back at a later date and we could do that, or?
Yeah, we ought to do. I'll tell you what, we ought to do one on, say, the interrelationship of complex systems theory and Taoism. That would be a really fascinating.
That does sound pretty fascinating. Let's do it with Taoism, Buddhism. Like, you did a little thing on this that I read, where you did a little parallel, right?
Yeah. I ran some connections between complexity science, complex systems theory, Taoism, and Stoicism. And there's some really interesting overlaps there.
So maybe if we could do like a, like the same thing, but in podcast form, and like you did there on your site,
Sure.
On all those three, and I think that would be really really interesting, because I'm interested in Stoicism, and I've been studying Buddhism and actually all of those philosophies recently. So that'll be really interesting to me, and hopefully to my viewers, or my listeners and viewers, I should say. Just to let people know that I have a channel now that I upload these podcasts to on YouTube. It's called the OAA Podcast. Yeah, it's OAA Podcast channel, which I upload these to. So now you can find this podcast on iTunes and on YouTube, and also on, also you can always catch it on Open Air Atheist Podcast at blogspot.com. So that's great. So I just opened up that channel just specifically for uploading the podcast episodes to that. So that's cool. Recently, I did a rap, and so I'm going to actually play it here in a second to take us out. So it's my first rap ever. So please, it's called "Dear Apologist." So with that said, folks, usually I would read like a little atheist quote, but I'm not going to do that this time because we're running over time, and I'm trying to keep these down to an hour, which is something I've not been able to really achieve. So I'm going to go ahead and end the show now. Dear apologists, I was once like you, back before I examined my own worldview. Back when I used to preach from a stool. Back when I thought the unbeliever was a fool. Back when my passion was to be God's tool. Back when I was a part of the Reformed Evangelist crew. But enough of the past, cause this isn't about me, it's about you. Take a look at your book without religious glasses. Understand why we call it the poison of the masses. Compare it with science, then take note how it clashes. Jolly jumping Jeebus, we're headed for hell just for disbelieving Jesus. Ain't that swell? Condone infanticide, then complain about the fetus. Fuck your religious dogma, it's destructive and needless. This shit is grievous. Faith got you acting like an intellectual Beavis. Like your brain is made of cheese whiz. Atheism's not a religion, it's fucking creepus. Please believe this. Reality is beauty, and I wish that you could see this. I must confess, your God delusion is fucking BS. Think for yourself, take your brain off the shelf. Or guess what? You can go fuck yourself.
Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you, and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, all wise. Now, you talk about a good bullshit story. Holy shit.
The apologist, your impossible gospel is hostile. The error in your argument is fucking colossal. Your worldview carbon dated like fossils. Your evidence, suspected writings of long dead apostles. You sell wishful thinking to wishful suckers. Get them hooked while they're young, you some motherfuckers. Jesus loves thee, fuck the fee. First one is always free. The big G loves those who give with glee. So sow a seed to me in my ministry. You dealing straight dopamine. Deluded and addicted to a hopeless dream. Enslaved to a Bronze Age control scheme. This shit is hopeless until you make reality your focus. Ditch the dreamland and all its hocus pocus. Let your mind be free and dopeless. You only got one life, don't blow this.
Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.